The training facility was located on the edge of neutral space, a vast and desolate station known for its grueling combat simulations. Here, recruits from dozens of species came to hone their skills in scenarios designed to test both body and mind. The facility was legendary, not just for the difficulty of its programs, but for the absolute precision of its alien instructors. Veterans of wars fought across systems, planets, and moons. Some of these wars had lasted longer than the lifespans of lesser species. Among these recruits, one species stood out as a curiosity: a human. Officially classified by the Galactic Council as a Deathworlder, humans were known to hail from a dangerous planet, but few in the galaxy had ever truly interacted with one in person. The tales of their toughness were often dismissed as exaggerated myths. After all, the galaxy was filled with races far more impressive on paper. Who could take seriously a species that only recently achieved interstellar travel? The alien instructors, however, were professionals. For them, it didn't matter if the recruit was a fragile Zilrix or a towering Brigathian. They would ensure that the combat simulations were fair and, above all, deadly. Instructor Farlock, a grizzled Hraloon warrior with 4 arms and a permanent scowl etched onto his wrinkled face, watched the new arrivals with a critical eye. He'd trained species that could crush asteroids in their bare hands. He'd taught tactics to civilizations that spoke in telepathic waves. So when he saw the human in the lineup, slim, average height, wearing an expression that bordered on casual boredom, he felt an immediate twinge of annoyance. This is going to be a disaster, he thought to himself. The other recruits took note of the human as well. Behind the human, a tall Thresk grunted in his throat, its eyes narrowing in what could only be described as alien confusion. To its right, a trio of Spaleks, multi-legged and shimmering with their exoskeletal armor, whispered among themselves in clicks and hisses, sneaking occasional glances at the human. Even the station's AI holographic avatar, a no-nonsense figure known as Sim Master Draenak, projected a slight flicker of doubt as it scanned the recruits. Its usual speech, encouraging warriors to embrace the brutality of the exercises, sounded almost dismissive when it addressed the human. Combat protocols are designed to test the limits of sentient beings, Draenak announced, its voice sharp and metallic. The weak will falter. Farlock crossed 2 of his arms while the others rested on his hips, his scowl deepening. He decided not to intervene. The simulations would weed out the unfit soon enough. He had no need to waste energy. The human, meanwhile, seemed completely unfazed. If anything, he looked relaxed. His name was Anders, and while most recruits were sweating under the oppressive gravity of the station, he appeared more focused on adjusting his wrist guard. As the others prepared for what was rumored to be the most punishing combat simulation in the galaxy, Anders yawned. He's not going to make it through the first round, Farlock thought, his scowl softening into one of weary expectation. Prepare yourselves. Draenak's voice cut through the murmurs, and the recruits stiffened. The doors to the training arena slid open with a hiss, revealing the massive battleground inside. A mix of hazardous terrain, shifting obstacles, and towering walls designed to simulate hostile environments from across the galaxy. It was not meant to be survivable. It was meant to break even the strongest. Anders stepped forward with the rest, seemingly unaware of the dread hanging over the group like a toxic cloud. The Thresk beside him offered a low growl of warning, something between a threat and a suggestion to get out of its way. Anders nodded, but didn't move, maintaining his spot in the line. Poor fool, Farlock thought, shaking his head as the recruits entered the arena. Inside the arena, the environment immediately changed. Heat surged from one side, bitter cold from another. The ground trembled as the obstacles shifted and rearranged themselves, creating a labyrinth of traps, pitfalls, and ambush points. Above them, drone-like creatures zoomed through the air, ready to unleash waves of fire, plasma, or concussive blasts at the press of a button. "Welcome to the first test," Draenak's voice echoed overhead. "Your goal, survival." A chorus of nervous growls, clicks, and alien huffs filled the arena as the recruits readied themselves. Blades were unsheathed, energy weapons powered up, and armor systems locked into place. Anders, he cracked his knuckles. No weapons, no armor enhancements, just his basic gear and a small grin that had now formed on his face. Farlock watched through the observation window as the simulation began. His arms tensed. He'd seen seasoned warriors collapse in these conditions. He'd seen entire squads of elite fighters taken out by a single well-placed plasma drone. And yet, as the first waves of drones descended on the recruits, Anders moved with precision. A roll here, a sidestep there. While the others scrambled for cover, he seemed to flow between the obstacles effortlessly. A plasma blast nearly grazed him, but he didn't even flinch. The Thresk next to Anders roared in frustration as it struggled with the weight of its own armor, trying to fend off the barrage of drones. Anders glanced at it, raised an eyebrow, and jogged forward, leaving the towering alien behind, bewildered. Farlock's scowl returned full force. "What is he doing?" he muttered. It wasn't panic, it was annoyance. The human wasn't supposed to be this calm. From his vantage point, he watched as Anders dodged a falling barrier, sprinted up a ramp that most species would find exhausting, and vaulted over a pit filled with searing acid as if he were out for a morning jog. The other recruits were gasping for air. The Spalax had already lost one of their members to a plasma burst, and the Thresk was limping badly, one leg injured from a stray energy beam. But Anders? He stopped to stretch. The simulation wasn't over yet, but for Anders, it might as well have been. As the simulation intensified, the gulf between Anders and the other recruits became even more apparent. The arena was now a battlefield of chaos. Energy blasts lit up the air, the ground shook with tremors, and obstacles loomed from all sides. Most of the recruits were in full survival mode, barely managing to avoid fatal hits. Sweat dripped, alien tongues lolled, and gasps of exhaustion echoed throughout the arena. But Anders? Anders was still calm. No, more than calm. He seemed completely at ease, as though the chaos around him was just background noise. He was light on his feet, dodging blasts and traps with an almost casual grace, not once breaking into a real sprint. If anything, he looked mildly bored. Instructor Farlock, watching from the control room, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His yellowish eyes narrowed, and two of his arms crossed tightly against his chest. The other two rested on the console as he leaned forward, trying to make sense of the human's performance. Surely, the human was using some hidden technology, some augmentation that Farlock hadn't detected during the initial scans. No being could navigate this level of difficulty with such ease, especially not a creature, as Farlock thought with disdain, soft as a human. There has to be something I'm missing, Farlock thought, zooming in the camera to track Anders more closely. Alert! Section 3 initiating, Simmaster Drenak's cold voice echoed through the arena. Anders didn't even flinch as the terrain shifted again. The walls of the arena split open, revealing a swarm of mechanized drones, armed with high-velocity shock rounds and acid projectiles. The Spalax screeched in unison, trying to form a defensive line with their multi-limbed bodies, while the Thresk roared in pain as an acid burst grazed its leg. Anders? He stepped to the side, avoiding the acid projectile with the nonchalance of someone avoiding a spilled drink. A shock round zinged past his head, and he ducked, almost lazily, glancing over at the drone that had fired it with mild curiosity, as though considering whether it was worth his time to engage. This can't be real, Farlock thought, now genuinely confused. He had trained battle-hardened species from some of the most dangerous environments in the galaxy, and none of them had performed this way, not even close. Meanwhile, down in the arena, the recruits were reaching their breaking point. One of the Spalax, too slow to evade an incoming shock round, took a direct hit and collapsed to the ground with a sharp, metallic click, its legs spasming in defeat. The Thresk was cornered, desperately fending off 3 drones with its massive claws, but even it was showing signs of fatigue. And then there was Anders. While the other recruits were running, panting, and scrambling for cover, Anders moved fluidly, weaving through the chaos like he was out for a leisurely hike. He avoided a collapsing pillar with a quick sidestep, hopped over a patch of electric currents with ease, and even took a moment to stretch his arms above his head before ducking under a low-hanging barrier. The Spalax leader, now the last of its trio still standing, clicked its mandibles in frustration, casting a disbelieving glance at Anders. What is he doing? It hissed in its own tongue, which, fortunately, was instantly translated by the universal comm system for everyone to hear. The other recruits were thinking the same thing. How was this human, this supposedly fragile creature, navigating the most challenging training scenario in the galaxy with such ease. The tension among the group had turned from competitive to outright confusion. Even fear. Was he toying with them? Was this some kind of test? The Thresk, still battling the drones, let out a pained snarl as another acid shot grazed its arm. "He's not even trying," the Thresk bellowed, his deep voice resonating through the arena, despite the cacophony of battle. Anders, hearing this, casually glanced back at the towering alien, giving a small shrug, as if to say, "Well, yeah." Then, without missing a beat, he dove into a roll, popped back up, and resumed his light-footed dance through the arena. Dodging and weaving like a seasoned athlete warming up before a match, Farlock could feel the tension rising in the control room as well. Around him, the other instructors, aliens from every corner of the galaxy, were starting to take notice of the anomaly playing out on the screens. Many of them had stopped their other duties to stare at the human, jaws slack, limbs frozen in mid-motion. "Instructor Farlock," came the voice of his assistant, a small, blue-skinned Gorvian with 4 eyes blinking in rapid succession. "Should I check the calibration on the simulation? This performance doesn't seem possible." Farlock didn't respond right away. His focus was entirely on the human. The Gorvian assistant was right. This performance didn't seem possible. But the readings from the simulation were accurate. The drones were operating at full capacity, and the environmental hazards were all set to their highest difficulty. And yet, there was Anders, treating the deadliest training scenario in the galaxy like it was a morning workout session. Another drone came screaming down from the sky, aiming directly at Anders. The human sidestepped it without breaking his stride. Then he yawned. Farlock's grip tightened on the edge of the control panel. He yawned? The Gorvian's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening and closing as he failed to form words. No one yawned during the simulations. No one even had time to breathe properly. Yet this human was displaying not just competence, but complete disinterest. By now, the other recruits had fallen into a grim pattern of watching Anders as much as they were fighting the drones. They couldn't help it. His nonchalance was impossible to ignore. One of the Spaleks, already wounded, looked at Anders in disbelief. "Are you some kind of lunatic?" it hissed, barely dodging another plasma burst. Anders chuckled, and replied with a grin. "This? Nah, this is just a bit of light exercise." The arena fell silent. Well, not literally. The drones were still firing, and explosions still rocked the ground. But every recruit, every alien, every instructor in the observation room suddenly felt like time had stopped. Light. Exercise. A light exercise? Farlock's eyes bulged, and his lower arms jerked reflexively. His assistants exchanged looks of pure, unfiltered confusion. Anders didn't seem to notice. He had already moved on to avoiding another wave of acid fire with a little skip in his step, a small smile still on his face. In the background, the Spalek collapsed in exhaustion, muttering to itself in its own language, too tired to even protest. Farlock's brain was working overtime to process what he had just witnessed. He knew something had to be done. Something to explain this. The silence that followed Anders' comment was broken only by the faint hum of the drones circling overhead. Alien recruits stared, jaws agape, mandibles twitching, limbs frozen in disbelief. The human, meanwhile, casually wiped some dust off his sleeve, completely oblivious to the absolute shock he had just caused. Instructor Farlock blinked. Twice. His forearms flexed unconsciously, and for the first time in years, he felt his usual gruff composure slipping. He had trained the finest soldiers across galaxies, warriors who could rip through steel with their bare hands and survive in the vacuum of space, but never had heard such a thing. Light exercise? Light exercise! Farlock's voice boomed through the control room, startling his assistants, who had been equally paralyzed by the human's audacity. The Gorvian assistant practically jumped out of his seat, his wide eyes blinking furiously in confusion. "Why, yes, Instructor Farlock," the assistant stammered, unsure of how to respond. He was just as stunned as the others. No one, not in the history of this academy, had ever called the most dangerous combat simulation in the galaxy light. Back in the arena, the recruits, though physically drained, seemed to find a second wind, not from their own strength, but from the sheer disbelief of what they had just heard. The Thresk, barely able to stand after its third acid wound, shot a glare at Anders, clearly insulted. The towering creature limped over, shaking off its exhaustion with the pure force of alien pride. "You think this is easy?" it growled, standing over the much smaller human, its voice filled with incredulity. "We are fighting for our lives, and you—" The Thresk's eyes narrowed to slits. "You dare call this a mild exercise?" Anders shrugged, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I mean, yeah, it's not too bad. Reminds me of an old obstacle course I used to do back on Earth, but with less mud." He glanced around, casually ducking as a drone zipped overhead, firing a round that missed him by millimeters. "I guess it's kind of fun, though. A bit more. Lively." The Thresk's 4 eyes blinked out of sync, trying to comprehend the human's words. Fun? Lively? The Thresk, who had once survived a nuclear storm on his home planet and had the scars to prove it, was now feeling like a fragile newborn compared to this nonchalant human. "You mock our struggle," the Thresk snarled, its large claws flexing. The other recruits, still panting and nursing their wounds, watched the confrontation with wide eyes, their disbelief now mixed with a sense of growing frustration. Anders didn't seem to notice the tension. One of the Spalaks, still twitching from a recent shock blast, clicked its mandibles in anger. "He's insulting us! This human thinks he's above the simulation. Let's see if he handles a real challenge." The tension was now palpable. Farlock, watching from above, had seen this coming. This was the moment. The recruits had taken the human's comment personally. In their eyes, Anders was not just some overconfident fool. He was disrespecting everything they had been through. And in a place like this, that kind of disrespect demanded an answer. Farlock's scowl deepened. He had half a mind to let the recruits teach the human a lesson, but protocol was protocol. He couldn't allow an all-out brawl between recruits during a live simulation, unless— His eyes flicked to the screen, then back to his assistant. A wicked idea began to form. "Increase the difficulty to maximum," Farlock ordered, his voice cold and controlled. "Let's give the human a real taste of galactic combat." The Gorvian blinked, startled by the command. "Instructor, are you sure? The maximum setting hasn't been—" "I said maximum!" Farlock barked, all 4 of his arms crossing over his chest. "I want to see if this human can still call it a mild exercise after this." The assistant hesitated for a moment, but Farlock's glare was enough to silence any further protests. With a few quick taps on the console, the difficulty level was pushed to its absolute peak. Back in the arena, a sudden shift in the environment was felt almost immediately. The ground beneath Anders' feet rumbled as the walls of the arena expanded, revealing new hazards. Spikes shot out from hidden crevices, plasma turrets emerged from the ground, and the sky above darkened as new drones, larger, faster, and far more lethal, descended into the chaos. The temperature dropped dramatically, and gale force winds whipped through the arena, throwing the alien recruits off balance. A cacophony of groans and grunts filled the air as the remaining recruits struggled to adapt. The Thresk planted its claws deep into the ground to avoid being swept away by the sudden gusts. One of the Spalaks, already on its last legs, was nearly skewered by a volley of plasma fire. Anders, however, barely reacted. He squinted at the new wave of drones, his brow furrowing slightly. "Oh, you guys cranked it up a notch, huh?" The Spalak, hearing this, let out a choked noise of disbelief. "Cranked it up a notch? This is impossible!" Anders chuckled. "Nah, this is just the part where it gets interesting." Before anyone could respond, Anders launched into action. He darted between plasma bursts with precision, dodging traps and leaping over obstacles like they were playground equipment. A turret locked onto him, but he spun around it with a quick pivot, using a nearby wall as leverage to vault himself over a row of spikes. The Thresk, now struggling to keep up with the new hazards, watched in pure disbelief as the human jogged past him, offering a quick nod of encouragement. "Hang in there, big guy," Anders said, his tone almost casual. The Thresk's pride was officially shattered. Meanwhile, Farlock leaned in closer to the screen, eyes wide. The human wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The maximum difficulty setting was supposed to be unbeatable, a challenge that could bring even the toughest species to their knees. Yet here was this human, dodging, jumping, and laughing through it. Farlock's mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was witnessing. Had the humans evolved beyond their classification as mere Deathworlders? Was this one individual just a freak of nature? There had to be some kind of explanation. A loud explosion rocked the arena, snapping Farlock from his thoughts. One of the Spaleks was hit directly by a plasma turret, its body skidding across the ground in a lifeless heap. The remaining recruits, now far beyond the point of exhaustion, were barely holding on. The Thresk stumbled, claws scraping the ground in desperation. But Anders? Anders was fine, more than fine. He had just disarmed a nearby turret by ripping out a power cable and was now using the sparking remains of it to swat away a drone like it was an oversized fly. Not bad, Anders muttered to himself, wiping a bit of dust off his face. Could use more variety, though. Farlock's fingers twitched on the console. His mind couldn't process it. This human was standing in the middle of the most dangerous training simulation in the galaxy, one that had claimed the lives of veteran soldiers, and he was suggesting it wasn't challenging enough. The Thresk, barely able to breathe, slumped down, glaring at Anders one last time before collapsing from sheer exhaustion. You're a monster, it wheezed, its pride completely obliterated. Anders stopped, looking down at the Thresk with a puzzled expression. Me? Nah, well, I guess you could say I'm pretty well trained. The irony of that statement hung in the air like a thick cloud. The alien recruits, most of whom were now either unconscious or completely incapacitated, had no response left. They had just faced the deadliest challenge of their lives, and yet the human, the one species they had all underestimated, had breezed through it like it was a casual weekend hobby. As Anders looked around the now silent arena, he scratched his head, almost disappointed. Well, I guess that's it? Farlock, now gripping the edges of the control panel with enough force to dent the metal, couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. This human, what is he? Instructor Farlock stood frozen in the observation deck, his eyes glued to the monitor. The maximum difficulty setting should have left every recruit in the arena begging for mercy. Yet there was Anders, standing in the middle of the chaos, looking like he'd just finished a casual afternoon jog. The arena, now littered with debris and groaning, half-conscious aliens, looked like a scene from a battlefield. Farlock had never felt so confused. He'd trained species who could manipulate gravity, beings that had withstood radiation that would fry lesser creatures in seconds, and warriors who could single-handedly defeat armies. But this human, this Deathworlder, wasn't just surviving the simulation. He was outperforming it. What is he? Farlock muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. His assistant, the blue-skinned Gorvian, glanced nervously at the screen, his 4 eyes blinking in rapid succession. Should we stop the simulation, instructor? The other recruits are... The assistant's voice trailed off as he watched one of the Spaleks twitch helplessly on the ground, clearly out of the fight. The Thresk, the largest and toughest of the bunch, was barely able to breathe after being knocked down by one of the more aggressive drones. Anders, meanwhile, was stretching his arms, flexing his fingers, like he was about to ask for round 2. Is this guy seriously not tired? The Gorvian thought to himself. No, Farlock snapped, cutting off his assistant's suggestion to end the simulation. We're not stopping anything. I want to see how far this human can go. The Gorvian hesitated but nodded, not daring to question the instructor's judgment. His fingers hovered over the controls, ready to make adjustments if things got too far out of hand. But Farlock's expression was one of deep focus. He wasn't about to let this spectacle end prematurely. In the arena, Anders tilted his head, cracking his neck. So, this is the hardest it gets, huh? He said to himself, casually swatting away the smoke from a nearby turret that had exploded just moments before. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the comm system, loud and furious. It was Farlock. "Recruit Anders," he growled, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. "You're telling me that this simulation, at its maximum setting, is just a light exercise for you?" Anders paused, glancing up at the ceiling where the voice came from. He smiled sheepishly. Yeah? I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a solid workout, but I've done tougher stuff back home. This kind of reminds me of a survival course we had in boot camp, except there was more snow, and the wolves were, a little bigger." Wolves? One of the few conscious Spaleks rasped from the ground, clearly struggling to process what was happening. Anders gave the Spalek a sympathetic nod. "Yeah, They're not so bad if you stay out of their territory, but once winter hits, well, you gotta stay sharp, you know? He casually wiped some dirt off his pants, as if chatting about holiday plans instead of galactic death simulations. Farlock was now absolutely dumbfounded. Human, you're telling me your planet, the very place you call home, is worse than this? Anders scratched the back of his neck, looking genuinely thoughtful for a moment. Well, it depends on the season, really. In summer, it's just the heat you have to worry about. Unless you're in the jungle, then the insects will try to eat you alive. Oh, and there's the occasional volcano eruption. But winter? Yeah, winter's a bit rough. The arena was silent again. Not because the simulation had paused. Far from it. The drones were still flying overhead, firing erratic blasts, and the ground beneath was still shifting unpredictably, but because every conscious being in that arena was too stunned to speak. One of the remaining recruits, a small, fur-covered alien known as a Velothian, had managed to crawl behind some cover. It poked its head out just long enough to stare at Anders in horror. Your planet has volcanoes? And giant wolves? Anders shrugged like it was the most normal thing in the world. Yeah, it's not too bad once you get used to it, although I do miss snowboarding when the winters are calmer. Farlock's eyes twitched. Boarding? Yeah, Anders replied, completely unaware of how absurd his casual remark sounded. It's a human thing. You strap yourself to a board and glide down a snowy mountain, great for balance training. There was another long pause. Even the relentless drones seemed to falter for a moment, as if they too were trying to process the sheer madness of what this human was saying. The Spalix and Thresk, creatures that had faced the deadliest predators in their own systems, now felt small. This human had turned a training scenario that had broken some of the galaxy's finest warriors into a conversation piece. Farlock slammed his fist on the control panel, causing the Gorvian assistant to jump again. Enough of this. Let's see if you handle this human. The instructor punched in a sequence that no one had seen used in centuries. Even the assistant recoiled in fear when he recognized the code. Instructor, I know what it is, Farlock snapped. Activate the final protocol. I want to see if this human can laugh his way through it. The arena rumbled. The ground beneath Anders' feet shifted, but this time it wasn't just another trap. The very walls of the simulation arena began to transform. Metallic pillars rose from the ground, and the air filled with an eerie hum. A dark fog began to roll in from the edges of the arena, obscuring the view of everything beyond a few meters. Anders cocked an eyebrow. Okay, now this looks interesting. Suddenly, a massive figure emerged from the fog. Towering above even the Thresk, it was an artificial behemoth, a war drone, custom-built for the most elite training exercises. No recruit had ever faced one, and for good reason. Its armor was impenetrable, its energy weapons devastating, and its AI programming ruthless. This was not a training drone. This was a war machine. The Velothian whimpered from behind its cover. The Thresk, still gasping for breath, looked up in pure terror. What is that? The Thresk muttered, barely able to speak. Anders grinned. Now we're talking. The war drone charged, its massive legs thundering as it tore through the arena, heading straight for Anders. Its energy cannons powered up, and the air around it crackled with electricity. This was a challenge designed to overwhelm even the strongest, most battle-hardened species. Anders didn't move at first. He watched it approach with an amused glint in his eyes, like a kid sizing up an overgrown schoolyard bully. As the war drone prepared to unleash its first devastating blast, Anders finally reacted. He darted to the side, faster than anyone expected, rolling across the ground and coming up on his feet in one smooth motion. Nice try, Anders said, his voice casual as the energy blast slammed into the ground where he'd been standing just moments before, leaving a smoldering crater. But you're too slow. The drone adjusted its targeting systems, but Anders was already on the move. He zigzagged across the arena, dodging blasts, slipping between obstacles, and using the environment to his advantage. For every shot the drone fired, Anders seemed to anticipate it, staying one step ahead of the machine's attacks. Farlock watched in disbelief. No one had ever been able to keep up with a war drone at full capacity. The thing was built to destroy, to crush even the toughest warriors under its relentless assault. And yet this human, this seemingly ordinary human, was playing with it. "What is he?" Farlock growled, his voice tinged with desperation. He leaned over the console, his eyes wide, trying to find some flaw, some weakness in the human's approach that would explain how this was possible. The Gorvian assistant, equally bewildered, could only stammer, He's winning." Anders ducked under a final blast, then sprinted toward the war drone. For a brief moment, the recruits watching from the sidelines thought he'd lost his mind. Charging at a war drone was suicide, even for a Deathworlder. But Anders wasn't charging blindly. As he neared the machine, he leaped onto a fallen pillar, using it as a launch pad to propel himself onto the drone's back. With the agility of a seasoned climber, he scaled the war drone, finding weak spots in its armor where the plates connected. He yanked open a small maintenance hatch, revealing the internal circuitry. "I've seen better programming on an old Earth toaster," Anders muttered, shaking his head. With a quick pull of a few wires, the war drone's power core flickered and its movements slowed. Anders jumped down just as the massive machine sputtered, sparks flying from its joints. The recruits watched, stunned, as the war drone staggered and collapsed with a resounding thud, smoke billowing from its remains. Anders stood up, dusted himself off, and grinned. "Okay, now that was a workout." Farlock, staring at the screen in utter disbelief, could only manage one word: impossible. The massive war drone lay smoking in the center of the arena, its once imposing frame now a lifeless heap of metal and sparks. The silence in the observation deck was deafening. Every alien instructor, every assistant, even the holographic sim master Dranak, stood frozen, eyes locked on the human who had just casually dismantled the most dangerous weapon in the facility. Anders, standing in the middle of the wreckage, stretched his arms above his head with a satisfied sigh, as if he'd just finished a light warm-up. He glanced around the arena, noticing the other recruits slowly emerging from their hiding spots, battered and bruised but still alive. Well, most of them. A couple of Spalax were being dragged off by med drones, their exoskeletons twitching faintly from residual shock. "Guess that's a wrap," Anders said, clapping the dust from his hands. The Thresk, who had been the most vocal earlier, now lay crumpled near the edge of the arena, breathing heavily, too exhausted and too broken to say a word. Its once powerful form looked small now, insignificant, as it gazed at Anders with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The Spalax were equally dumbstruck, clicking their mandibles quietly, as if afraid that speaking might somehow make the situation worse. Farlock, still gripping the edges of the console in the observation deck, finally managed to speak. His voice was a low growl, strained with frustration and something he couldn't quite admit to himself: fear. How? How did he do it? The Gorvian assistant, who had been nervously fidgeting with the controls, turned to Farlock, blinking his wide blue eyes. I don't know, Instructor. The system's running perfectly. All the diagnostics show that the simulation was at full difficulty, and the war drone was operating at peak capacity. It's like he's just built for this. Farlock's jaw tightened. Built for this. Those words echoed in his mind. This was supposed to be the ultimate test, a crucible where only the strongest emerged. And yet, a human, a species that most of the galaxy considered primitive and fragile, had just breezed through it like it was a children's game. Farlock slammed his fist on the console, sending a loud crack through the room. "This is unacceptable," he roared, spinning around to face his assistant. "Humans aren't supposed to be this strong, this fast, this invincible." The Gorvian assistant flinched but quickly recovered, his four eyes darting nervously between Farlock and the monitor. "But Instructor, the human didn't just survive. He thrived. There's no explanation in the system's records for this kind of performance." "Then get an explanation," Farlock snapped, his frustration spilling over. "There has to be a reason. Maybe the simulations were too weak. Maybe the war drone was defective. Something has to explain how this human..." His voice trailed off as he stared at the screen, watching Anders casually make his way to the exit of the arena, whistling a cheerful tune to himself. In the arena below, the other recruits were slowly limping toward the medical bays, casting wary glances at Anders as they passed him. None of them dared to say a word. The Thresk, barely able to walk, managed to grunt out a single phrase as it hobbled past. "You're a freak of nature," it muttered, more to itself than to Anders. Anders glanced over, raising an eyebrow. "Thanks, big guy. You weren't too bad yourself." The Thresk groaned in response, unable to muster the energy for anything more. Its pride was shattered, its spirit crushed. The realization that a human, a species it had considered far beneath its own, had bested the ultimate galactic training had drained every ounce of fight from its soul. As Anders reached the exit of the arena, he paused, looking back over his shoulder at the wreckage of the war drone. He let out a low whistle of appreciation. "Gotta hand it to you guys, though," he said, knowing full well that the instructors were watching him. "That was a pretty good piece of tech. Almost got me sweating." The surviving recruits could only stare in stunned silence as Anders casually waved and walked out of the arena, disappearing behind the sliding doors. In the control room, Farlock slumped into his chair, all four arms resting limply by his sides. He couldn't believe what had just happened. This simulation was designed to break even the most hardened warriors from across the galaxy. It had been Farlock's pride and joy, his ultimate test of strength and resilience, and now it felt meaningless. The Gorvian assistant, still nervously fidgeting with the controls, finally spoke. "Instructor, what do we do now?" Farlock didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, trying to comprehend what this meant for the future of galactic training. If this human, this Anders, could do what no one else had done, then what were the implications? Were humans stronger than they had thought? Was the Galactic Council wrong about the Deathworlders? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Farlock sighed, the sound low and defeated. We need to recalibrate our standards," he muttered, the bitterness in his voice unmistakable. The Gorvian assistant blinked, confused. "Recalibrate?" Farlock nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the now empty arena. "If humans can breeze through our toughest training like it's nothing, then we have to raise the bar. We have to be prepared. Because if Anders is any indication, we've severely underestimated them." The assistant swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The very idea that the galactic standard for combat training had been surpassed by a human, no less, was difficult to process. Farlock, rubbing his temples with his lower arms, finally stood up, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. "Make a note of this day. It's a turning point," he said, his voice still thick with disbelief. "We need to inform the Council. The humans aren't what we thought they were." The assistant quickly jotted down the order, his hands shaking slightly. Farlock had never sounded so uncertain, so shaken. As Farlock turned to leave the control room, he glanced back at the screens one last time, watching the repair drones begin to clean up the wreckage in the arena. The war drone that had once been the pinnacle of galactic combat training now lay in ruins, defeated not by a veteran soldier, but by a Deathworlder who thought the simulation was just a light exercise. Farlock clenched his fists. He wasn't sure what the future held now, but one thing was certain. "Next time," he muttered under his breath, "I'll be ready."